Clap. Jeb Bush once had to say, please clap.
That's right.
Yeah.
Chuck Todd, welcome.
Thank you.
You are NBC News chief political analyst after many, many years at Meet the Press moderating.
Yes, ma'am.
You host a podcast called the ToddCast.
Yep. I'm stuck with it when she named a podcast after your last name.
Chuck ToddCast.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have an Illinois connection. What's that?
My mother grew up in Grundy County, Morris, Illinois. She was born in Bloomington. She spent a year here, didn't take. She ended up at the Art Institute for another semester, and then ended up at the University of Miami. So it was Suntan U then, when she ended up there. I will say this, my great memory of the University of Illinois is connected to the University of Miami's first national title. So I'll do a quick history. This was back before we had something called the College Football Playoff. We had these crazy things. We had these football conferences. They were divvied up by geographic region. So it was crazy. You had Midwestern schools were all in the same conference in the Midwest, and the West Coast schools were all in the same conference on the West Coast. I know today we don't think this way anymore. Well, Miami was ranked 5th going in, and everybody played their bowl games on the same day. Miami was ranked 5th, playing the #1 team in the country. Illinois was ranked 4th, playing UCLA. Auburn was ranked 3rd, playing Michigan in the Sugar Bowl, and Texas was ranked 2nd, playing in the Cotton Bowl. So 1 versus 2 didn't play each other, and Miami needed all these other teams to lose, and Illinois lost the Rose Bowl that year, one of the few times they made it to the Rose Bowl. Thankfully, they lost. Sorry, guys. And it handed Miami its first national title. So with that, I'm forever grateful.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And I don't understand why Illinois football isn't better. And I'm glad to see the winning ways of Illinois football. You got Chicago to the north, St. Louis to the south. What a great couple of places to recruit. There's no excuses. So come on, fill them up. Go win a Big Ten title, buddy.
Let's stay with Illinois. Champaign County here went roughly 60-40 for Kamala Harris. But if you look at any surrounding county around us, they went for Trump by even wider margins. What did you learn about the presidential election from states like Illinois?
Well, what's interesting is how different the battleground states ended up versus the non-battleground states, right? One of the reasons Donald Trump won the popular vote is his improvement, not in the battleground states, but his improvement in Illinois, New Jersey, New York, California, Virginia, you name it. In a blue state, he improved his numbers anywhere from, and essentially he's already kind of maximized his support in rural counties. But his great improvements were in the urban areas. Ironically, if you saw, Harris actually did either the same or even slightly better in suburban counties. And that's the Democratic Party's problem right now. If you'd have told them they were going to be the party of the suburbs 10 years ago, they'd have said, really? That's great. And they would have assumed that was, but that assumed that they were going to continue to have the advantages that they had in the urban areas. And what has been interesting about our political geography now is rural New Mexico and rural Virginia have more in common than rural Virginia does with Arlington, Virginia.
100 miles away.
100 miles away,
yeah.
Exactly. So it is in suburban, the suburbs of Chicago vote like the suburbs of Atlanta that vote like the suburbs of Milwaukee, right? And so we are...
What's that based on? Is it education level? Is it...
The suburbs, it's clearly education. And we are divided on class and education.
Yeah.
And if we're divided on class and education, then Trump's numbers make a lot more sense. He's the head of the party of the working class. Well, the working class is both a large chunk of it's in rural America and a large chunk of it's in urban America. Suburban America is the educated class, and that has become the party of the Democrats. And that's sort of the base of the Democratic Party. And the fact is, there's just not enough votes. If we divide on education, the party of the non-college educated voter is going to be the majority party.
How much do the parties matter anymore?
So, it's funny. we've never been, it's one of those things where we are more divided on ideology, and yet the parties have never been weaker, right? Red and blue has never been stronger, and the two parties have never been weaker, right? The parties cannot decide who their candidates are, right? They'd love to, and they have no control. The Republican Party infrastructure tried to stop Donald Trump in their feckless ways, but they tried. They just had no power. They couldn't do it. So what is fascinating is the power that the voter wants to give those running the parties, but the parties itself are not strong. I think it's worth noting that the fastest growing party is non-party.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that more voters under 40 are registering as non-party over, Gen Z is more likely to register as an independent or unaffiliated. Ideologically, Gen Z may lean more liberal than conservative, but the distrust of the two parties has only increased, and I think there is a lot of people who are uncomfortable feeling as if they're a member of either party. So, look, I go through. I think we would be better off if we were a four-party system. In a perfect world, I think that two political parties are basically, they're just coalition parties, right? They're not. And in fact, Trump's cabinet reminds me of a cabinet you would see put together in Europe. Very factional. It's like he's got to have different parts of his coalition represented. The Kennedy faction, they get a cabinet seat. He gives his big donors, they get something over here. But he's been having to give pieces of, he's not giving the establishment wing of the GOP anything.
Yeah.
Maybe Marco Rubio about as close as you're going to get. He's going to give them the State Department, and that's about it.
Right.
Right. So but you could make a case that both parties are too big to succeed, because if you have coalitions that big on the Democratic side, right? If you're going from AOC to Liz Cheney, right? And on the Republican side, you're going from Joe Rogan, right, to pick your evangelical leader, Franklin Graham, right? Like these really are kind of unusual coalitions. And, I look back on 2016, if we were a European, we were more like France. France really is kind of a four-party system. You'd have had four-party nominees, would have been Bernie Sanders of the sort of the Greens, if we, right, that's what the more progressive you'd have had. So Sanders, you'd have had Hillary Clinton as the center-left nominee. You'd have had a Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio as sort of the center-right nominee. And then you'd have had the nationalist candidate or populist right candidate and Trump. And in many ways, that's a cleaner divide, I think, of if we had four parties, there'd be, and that's the world. I think it would be easier to, if you have to put a coalition together in order to get power, you're more likely to use a coalition to enact power. So in some ways, I think it would serve us better if we could acknowledge that none of our four parties could ever get a majority, and so you always have to work with some other entity to do that. So I just throw that out there but look, we're not, as I say, there's only two teams that make the Super Bowl, not three or four, right? So it's a binary choice.
Yeah.
This is the world, and the two parties run a duopoly. They've made it impossible for a third or fourth party to really get traction unless it's a cult of personality. And that's never going to change as long as the two parties can control ballot access. And in that case, the duopoly does. If any of you are in business classes, I think the two parties are the very definition of a duopoly.
So let's talk about bridging the divide then. What is an issue, or what are multiple issues that Donald Trump could work across the aisle on with Democrats?
Well, I think there's certainly some of the trade proposals are there. I think are real. I think we're likely to have a new entitlement. There's definitely a bipartisan consensus.
When you say entitlement, what?
Meaning a new entitlement, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I think we are going to have a care something. And I say something, child care tax credit, is sort of a piece of it, but I think it's going to expand it overall. I think that, look, I'm a member of the squeezed generation here, right? Where I have a grandmother in assisted living. My mother's 80, and I got 2 kids in college, right? Now I have resources, so but there are plenty of people in my generation that don't have the same amount of resources. I think that is a real thing. J.D. Vance has expressed support for it. Marco Rubio's expressed support for it. Rosa DeLauro is a Connecticut congresswoman who's been trying to push this for 30 years, right? So, and Donald Trump, I've always said he is not a small government conservative. He is a strong government conservative, might be and I don't even want to get into what is the definition of a conservative anymore, right? Like everybody, my father's conservatism is not today's Republican Party conservatism, in that sense. But I think that if anything is quote done together, it would be that. The irony is that there's more of an appetite for that on the left than on the right. But there's some important
appetite for working together, or appetite for the entitlement?
For that new entitlement. But I do think it's at the heart. I think one of the things that really hurt Biden and Harris in this whole thing was when the checks stopped. I think those COVID checks mattered a lot to people. And I think when the COVID checks stopped, and it's one of those things, they stopped under Biden. So I just think a lot of people missed that cushion. And that's what it was. It was cushion, right? It was cushion from the unexpected car repair payment. It was cushion. And it shows you I don't know how we can afford it long term, but there's clearly a lot of people felt like it was a necessity, not a luxury. And so I think if you're asking me something big that could happen, it would be that. But look, I think realistically with these small majorities in Congress, I think the first year of the Trump presidency is going to look a lot like the first year of the Biden presidency. They're going to have one giant bill that they're going to try to cram as much as they can into. So remember, Build Back Better, they try to get as much into it. Then Joe Manchin, and they're like, then it got pulled back. But he got something, and it was pretty big. But he got one bite at the apple. They did something called reconciliation in the Senate. They knew they had narrow majorities. They really didn't have a lot of room for error. While there's a slightly larger advantage that Trump has than Biden did in the Senate, he has a much smaller advantage than Biden had in the House. And so they're going to have one shot. Obviously, extending the Trump tax cuts is priority one. That's the most unifying aspect in the Republican Party. So they're going to get, what else can they put in there, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to be what the first year is about. How big of a bill are they going to try to make it? At some point, then you'll find out who will be the Republican Joe Manchin. I think you have in the Senate, I would put Murkowski, Collins, and McConnell in their own bucket. They will just not be, they will operate on their own. They will not be sort of bullied or anything. But Trump can lose 3 votes anytime he wants in the Senate and still get what he wants. The question is, who's going to be the 4th senator? And the people like Bill Cassidy who voted to convict him, but who's up for re-election in 26. You have Tom Tillis in North Carolina, who didn't vote to convict him, but came awfully close and certainly is known as a Trump critic, but he's also up in 26. You have Todd Young of Indiana, who never endorsed Trump. James Lankford is always somebody that to be mindful of. And the Romney replacement, John Curtis, ran as sort of the Romney candidate in the primary and won. So he is not going to be, but what is it? Utah and Wisconsin were the only 2 states that didn't go in a more Republican direction than 4 years ago. Utah.
Yeah.
So Curtis is, who becomes that sort of, which one or 2 of them become, I think they will become the focal points, but I don't know which one of them it will be yet.
Okay.
And I think it'll depend on their own. When you look at a guy like Cassidy or Tillis, it's sort of, do they want to be senators again?
Yeah.
Do they want to be Republicans still? Or do they want to run as independents, which I think is a possibility in the case of Cassidy in particular. So how they could, remember Manchin ended up leaving the party. So I think there'll be I think we're likely to see something like that. So that to me is what the first year or 18 months drama is going to feel like.
Okay, let's talk about the drama this week.
Yeah, conventionally.
Let's talk about Hunter Biden.
Yeah.
What kind of political gift is pardoning Hunter Biden for Donald Trump and the Republicans?
Look, it's a huge gift. This is presidential acts become permission slips.
Yeah.
And this presidential act is now a permission slip to Donald Trump. And to me, there's a few things that are disturbing about this pardon. Number one, it was a jury trial. This was American citizens who took time out, did their civic duty. This was not some kangaroo court. It was a jury trial. To me, that should be even a higher bar and he's overturning the result of the trial. You know, it would be one thing. I don't understand why they didn't wait for sentencing. Could have done sentencing's is going to happen in this month.
Yeah, the 10th.
It felt a little early. You know, frankly, do what Clinton did. Pardon Mark Rich on the way out the door and leave on Marine One and get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't have happened in Mark Rich's case, but if you're going to do this, I almost would have run scared doing it, or at least wait, but a more proper thing. So that's one aspect of this. But the 10-year get out of jail free card that he got, this is the most expansive pardon since Nixon. It's not just a pardon for what he got convicted of.
Right.
It's a pardon for anything that might have happened between, sometime the month before he started doing business in Ukraine and, the end of Biden's term. Well, what's the likelihood that come January 10th of 2029, an outgoing President Trump issues blanket pardons to everybody that worked for him over the last 10 years, that begins June 15th, 2015, when he rode down that escalator, and culminates January 20th, 2029. And people will protest, and he'll say, well, he did it. And, I know that people get frustrated with both siderism. You can sit here and say, one is different than the other. The problem is Biden ran on a platform and a message to the public that he was going to be better than Trump, that he was going to follow the rule of law. And look, I read every transcript of the Hunter Biden trial in June. And the biggest conclusion I came away with is I can't believe Joe Biden ran for president the first time. With all of his children in crisis at that moment. He had a daughter who was in recovery, a son who clearly was still struggling, and a widowed daughter-in-law who their son got addicted to crack and who testified under an immunity deal. And they ran for president anyway. And so I'm sorry, I don't have empathy for him when he writes in his rationale for the pardon that they came after Hunter because they were coming after me. You made this choice. You knew the situation in your family, and you put the country and your family in this situation. I empathize with you as a father, but you feel bad for decisions you made that put he put his ambition ahead of his family, and now he regrets it. I'm personally sorry for him. It is what makes it feel Shakespearean in many ways. But I think he just set a precedent that we're all going to regret. And here's the other part of it. His rationale was he makes the case that these prosecutions of Hunter Biden were politically motivated. It's the exact same thing that Donald Trump claims against him. I'm going to set aside measuring who's right and who's wrong here. Here's the reality. The leading Democrat in America says our law enforcement has been infused with politics and that prosecutions are politically motivated. The leading Republican in this country has said prosecutions in the justice system are politically motivated. What's the American people hearing? That prosecutions in the Justice Department are politically motivated in stereo. That's a problem. That's not legal. Look, when character is like, we throw out, character is, to me, is about, we need to measure the character of somebody who wants to be in office, whether they are a political appointee, running the Pentagon, or running for president. Because we want to know, character is revealed during moments that Biden faced. He had to make a decision. Was he going to violate the oath that he took to the Constitution? Or was he going to protect his family? I'm sorry he was in that position. It's a tough position. I think many of us probably would have made the same decision Biden would have made, which is, it's going to be easier for me to live with my family for the rest of my life. Screw my legacy. Because I've never lost a child, and I hope I never have to deal with what Joe Biden dealt with. It's pretty clear to me that entire families never dealt with Beau's death. And they brought America along with it. And we have Donald Trump still, and I look at this, and
do you think
these are actions Joe Biden took that put his party in this position, put the country in this position, and helped bring Donald Trump back. He owns it. And I understand the pardon from a personal and his own personal guilt because he put Hunter in this situation in some ways.
Yeah.
Hunter made some bad decisions on his own, but he put him in this position. If he doesn't run for president, nothing happens to Hunter.
What do you think?
That's a hard thing to live with for Joe Biden. So
Sure.
I get it as a human being, but I think this is going to do long-term damage.
What long-term damage to Joe Biden's legacy, or
Forget Joe Biden's legacy. I'm talking about
America?
the view of the rule of law.
Yeah.
I mean, if the FBI comes knocking on my door right now, I'm not going to believe them. I'm not.
You, Chuck Todd, wouldn't believe the FBI?
Nope. They came to my door claiming I did something, I'd assume it's manufactured. I mean, my point is, I'd weirdly feel afraid, but for the different reason. I now, and I say this.
That's pretty incredible.
Well, I can't believe I'm feeling this way, but
yeah.
I go back to the leading Democrat in America said this, and the leading Republican has said this.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it is not an irrational view to now believe this. I had a friend of mine who was wanted to be a stand-up comedian. A lot of political reporters want to be something else. Yeah. I'm a recovering sports reporter, but there was this one joke that my friend used to tell about. He says, imagine if beer companies adopted the same tactics as our political party. Miller Lite says it's less filling, but do they really tell you that they put, and you just sort of read one of the weird 7-syllable ingredients in beer, right? Thomazine or something like this, right? And then Miller would respond by saying, Bud Light claims it's this, right? Well, what would happen? Eventually, people wouldn't stop drinking Miller Lite to drink Bud, or stop drinking Bud to drink Miller Lite. They'd stop drinking beer. Because we were telling them how awful these beers were over and over again. And then you find out, why does everybody think beer is awful? Well, they've been spending all this time telling you that beer's awful. That's the situation that I think we're in right now with the weaponization of the rule of law, or the perceived weaponization of the rule of law.
Wow.
And I'm sorry.
I'm
going off on a rant. I'm not done with this because I know I can anticipate what some of the criticism is going to be, which is, remember, the Democrats are the ones that asked to be held to a higher standard. Joe Biden campaigned on having a higher standard. And when the chips were down, he didn't do it. It's not a small error.
I'm just letting that soak in.
Rant over.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I haven't heard you talk like that before. I've known you for 20 years. Okay, let's talk about weaponization, because it's easier to say than politicization.
Politicization, yeah.
Yeah.
Finally, autocorrect can finally write bulletization in my phone. I use it enough.
You famously had that interview with Kellyanne Conway where she talked about alternative facts.
A little more prescient than I expected.
Yeah.
In that interview. Who knew? I was actually more onto something than we thought.
Well,
right?
Talk about that. Maybe for everyone who might not remember that interview, if you were in high school or middle school.
Yeah, it was the Sunday after the inauguration was Friday or Saturday. No, the inauguration was Friday. And Sean Spicer goes on that Saturday. Remember, he went on the podium on Saturday and
Saturday morning crowd.
And said it was the largest crowd ever, and it was like obviously not true. And it was sort of one of these things, I was sort of a dog with a bone with it when I had Kellyanne on the next morning, and I'm like, I've been in that White House room. Major pronouncements about America's role in the world take place from behind that podium. When what is said behind that podium has got to be the pure truth of government. Hard stop. It's not the place to play games like that.
Yeah.
Do that outside. There's sort of, I always said in politics, there's honor among thieves. Like there's a place for lying, but it's not there. And when she, it was always funny if you watch the clip, she says alternative facts, like it was sort of like, as she's saying it, she realizes, I don't know what I'm saying here, but I'm trying to say something. And the thing is that now in hindsight, somebody's going to say, well, it turned out it was this is exactly the ecosystem that Donald Trump has built. By the way, the irony is one of the cause celebs of mainstream media during, after January 6th was to deplatform anybody involved with it. Well, what did that accomplish? It got Donald Trump to build his own information ecosystem that the Democrats have no clue how to penetrate. I mean, this is sort of like careful of the unintended consequences of deplatforming him for Twitter and Facebook. He created an ecosystem where mainstream America didn't see how crazy he was being on Truth Social, but his people did. I mean, it ended up a brilliant construction, and so now they have an alternative factual ecosystem, just totally over here.
Yeah.
And in some ways, we collectively, I was the sort of the...
We the media.
I was sort of in the minority of like, I never would say I would refuse to book somebody on the show. I would never refuse to interview Vladimir Putin. Right. Why am I afraid of putting Kevin McCarthy on? But CNN pledged, we are never booking Kevin McCarthy. I'm like, he's going to be Speaker of the House someday. Why would you ever say that? And of course, they eventually had to book him, and then you look silly backtracking.
Yeah.
And when you're in the news business, you shouldn't be in the censoring business. You never know when somebody has relevant information. And that's used to be my answer back then. People would say, how come you're still booking these people? And I'm like, why won't you say you won't do it? And I said, simply because I don't know that someday they may not have relevant information. And ultimately, that's my job, is to facilitate relevant information to the public.
Okay, so we have an audience question. What are ways for younger journalists to protect the institution of journalism?
To just,
here's a follow-up.
Do good journalism. I mean, there's not.
And what does that mean to you?
Fact-based reporting and show your work. It's just, it's sort of, and also show what you don't have. Right? Like, you don't always have every answer.
Yeah.
But you know what you're missing too. Here's what we know, and here's what we don't know. And sometimes if you could just think about every news story that you write, once you write it, and you ask yourself, okay, what's missing? What's everything I know? Write down on the list, see if you mentioned it in your story. What's everything I don't know?
Yeah.
What should I for the things I don't know, what will add context to the reader? What will add context to the viewer? So to me, that's always been a way I've double checked something, which is, you put together your narrative, whether it's a script for TV or your article for digital, but then say to just make your basic fact list of everything that needs to be in there. I wish there was this magic way of like fixing, I think the only way we fix our credibility is to rebuild local media.
So tell me about that.
So I think national media has never had credibility with the public.
Why not? What's wrong with us in the national media?
We're too far away.
Yeah.
The farther away anything is, the more distrustful we are, the more two-dimensional you are. Think about your own lives. If you know somebody that works at a certain place, then you feel like you have a better idea of what that place is like. If you don't know somebody from a local factory or a local this, you can be automatically more distrustful, right? It just is. And then, of course, national news is further away. But the beauty of this local, we had this perfect business model for about 50 years. And it turned out we had classified advertising was a great revenue stream to support journalism. And then a dude named Craig came along and goes, why are classifieds free? A legitimate question. Yada, yada, yada. Donald Trump became president. A lot happened.
That's kind of an abbreviated version.
Well, it is. But what it turned out was, and what we've learned over time, and there's actually some terrific academic research about the sort of Craigslist effect, because it's hugely important in the destruction of local news, which is hugely important in the destruction of the credibility of national news, which is hugely important of this polarized divide that we live in. Mm-hmm. And that was basically, if you were a newspaper circulation of about 50,000 or less, a majority of your revenue came from classifieds. Look, classifieds, in the 90s, and it didn't matter where you worked. The Washington Post, this Sunday classifieds, the want ads, if you were looking for a job, the only place in
Washington, or a house or apartment.
Yeah, you went to the classifieds. You were looking for a place to live. Yeah. You went to the classifieds. My parents were garage sailors when that was a thing in the early 80s. My God, that was another thing. You go to classifieds, see where the garage sales were, right? And we had these things called maps. You had to open them up. So all of that goes away, and there's no easy way to replace that. And then, we went through these horrible efficiencies, and the biggest conclusion I came to is we stopped covering national news from a local perspective. And that is what's missing. Sometime in the 90s, in the digital revolution, I'll give you an example. Knight Ridder is a good way to. Knight Ridder was this newspaper conglomerate, and they were the bad guys of the early 90s, because they were before there were hedge funds. There was Knight Ridder and there was McClatchy, and they were buying up all these regional papers and creating. Trust me, we long for the days of Knight Ridder and McClatchy now in the news business. But Knight Ridder had about 30 metro dailies: Miami Herald, Philadelphia Inquirer, St. Paul Pioneer Press, Kansas City Star, Fort Worth Star Telegram, I think was one, San Jose Mercury News. I used to know all of these. Don't ask what I did. What I did for a living in the 90s made me very familiar with newspapers of all sizes. But the Knight Ridder Washington Bureau had one person for every single one of their titles. And they'd all write 30. So Congress passes a big bill. Big thing happens in Washington. There are 30 versions of the story that Knight Ridder's writing. But each one has a different sort of first 2 or 3 paragraphs that are about the local congressman or senator, maybe about how it impacts locally, maybe, what money would come to the region specifically. And it turned out that was a useful story, right? But some bean counter came along and go, why do we have 30 versions of this? We can cut our Washington Bureau, by 90%, and we can run the same story in all the newspapers. Well, if you're a news junkie, you will go out and get all the information you need. But if you're not a news junkie, you sort of get passively educated. And the newspaper was a beautiful thing to sort of passively educate people. You might have read the newspaper the first thing you want to go to the box scores. We used to get something called the Miami News in the afternoon in Miami, because my dad and I were Dodger fans on the East Coast. And you couldn't get the West Coast box scores in the morning Miami Herald, but the afternoon paper, the Miami News, had it. Well, the only reason we subscribed to the afternoon paper was for we were those people. Some people wanted the movie listings, right? There was something for everybody in that one, but you might glance at the first couple of graphs. In fact, there's been some interesting academic research on this too, that showed that if you were, and it's still true today, if you get a newspaper delivered to your house, you're more likely to vote. Seems pretty logical. So these academics wanted to find out, What happens if you get a newspaper delivered to your house involuntarily? Okay? You didn't ask for it, but it showed up anyway. Would it increase the likelihood of vote? So they had to control, sure enough, the act of picking up that paper off your driveway, taking it to your recycle bin, informed people enough of when election day is that it increased voter turnout among those that got that newspaper delivered to their house. So, sorry, I gotta stop.
I'm gonna put that in my pocket.
I will just keep it down. I'll keep it down for it. So the point is these are the things that I think now in hindsight we've learned what we've lost. So we need more people reporting on what happens in Washington who don't live in Washington, who live in the community where Washington is impacting and who understand. And, when I first started in this business, the best political reporters were not in Washington. You had the Des Moines Register, a guy named David Yepsen, or you had a guy named Steve Kraske at the Kansas City Star, or you had a guy named Carl Lubsdorff at the Dallas Morning News. And then they all ended up in Washington. And so we don't have, what happened was local news organizations got the digital data, and so they started laying off journalists based on what stuff was being read. So the first people that got laid off were the political reporters. It was, quote, the least read, right? The sports was more read and all this stuff. And I just, I just think that erosion over time, and now, of course, we all miss the community. We all miss, and so I think what's interesting is I hear people miss local news. They do feel like they know less about what's going on in their community. So I think the demand is there. I think we need to create a revenue stream. I do not believe in nonprofit media. I don't think it works long term. I think there are nonprofit adjacent ideas that can help media in this period. But I think we have to find a revenue stream. I think youth sports and high school sports are the way to go. I think focusing on, I have this notion that all local news organizations, whatever you want to call these, I almost don't want to use the word news. Your North Star should be the information help desk for your community. And that a really good local news organization, your North Star is you're helping people live their life. Exposing corruption at the city council is helping people live their life. And telling them how the DMV now works is also helping them to live their life. Telling them, where a music festival is going to be in the region is another way to. My point is that there are different ways to connect with the community, but you've got to, I think if you make that the North Star, you'll get more. In youth sports, you want to talk about a way to bring red and blue back together. We all want to see our kids play sports, and if you can be in the same way that we at NBC are we're going to start putting the NBA in at night on weeknights because it'll get a better number than whatever Chicago Hope program we come up with, right? We have Chicago Fire, Chicago Police,
Chicago Med.
Chicago Med. We haven't done Chicago Schools yet. I don't really want to touch that, right? Chicago politics, right? There's all sorts, but we can keep going. I don't know how many more Chicago spinoffs we can do. So a little NBA at night, right? So I want all these local news outlets to be the front door for you to be able to see your kids play high school sports or youth sports. If you're late for work and you can't catch, right now it's a series of parents. Sometimes you can get stuff streamed, sometimes you can't. Well, what if you had your local news organization was the one that was the front door for you to get all of this?
Are you paying for that?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think people will pay to see their grandkids and kids if they can't come. And I just think and you're more likely to get the local car dealer now to advertise again with you because they realize they're coming to use sports. And I hope to give a toolbox. I want every Little League coach to have to use my local news platform and offer them all sorts of ways. Maybe give them an AI program to help write a story about the game that night, right? You give them a toolbox that bring their community in and they can follow Little League and they know what the practice schedule is, but you do all of that there. I just think they're in the same way you've got people at the New York Times brainstorming other ways to raise revenue, to support sending reporters to Gaza. Because you know what people will not pay for? Is news about Gaza. That doesn't mean the reporting doesn't matter. So if they're gonna do more Sudoku, great. Charge them for that so we can pay for Gaza coverage. But I think we can think of local media in the same way. There are all sorts of ways that community information help desk, that mentality can become a trusted source of local information. And over time, I think that rebuilds the ecosystem. I mean, we're not going to be able to, look, we don't control our distribution anymore. The 5 tech companies do. It's a huge issue. We can complain about it and watch government do nothing about it, or we could at least try to improve as I joke, our information ecosystem. It's as if we put our drinking water in our sewage pipe and use the same pipe for both, right? And we're the ones having to filter out our water from all the you-know-what in order to figure out what's drinkable and what isn't. I think another way to flush out that pipe, that information sewer pipe, is to get more good information into it.
Okay, so I have a follow-up from the audience then, from a student, it sounds like. In a time full of opinionated and often partisan news, where can our generation go to get the facts on today's major issues?
I just think you can't just assume you have to get it from one place.
What's your news diet?
So I'm a weird guy. I subscribe to every email alert that's offered.
And does that drive you crazy?
Now it does, since I'm no longer a first responder, right? I do a lot more deleting in the morning. But I always wanted to make sure I had that I got the news headlines from at least one major paper in every state in the union.
Wow.
And I looked at multiple ones in many states. Because that was, even just getting a front page, you get an idea of what's happening in that community. What is, if there's a huge property tax fight like Montana, there's certain things that, like, Montana is just fighting about 2 things right now. Property taxes they screwed up their rate. They screwed up how they their rate system. So they had this huge spike because property values have skyrocketed with all the people moving into Montana, and essentially the Republican legislature forgot to fix it, and they'd been doing a fix every year, but this is the first year they didn't do it. So tax bills like doubled and tripled, right? In Florida, the number one issue that people talk about all the time in Florida is property insurance. And the fact that my mother lives in Orlando, and not on the coast, okay, Orlando, and she's on it's the 3rd different insurance company in 5 years that's, quote, gone under or leaving the state. And this is, so the point is that you got to sort of I always want to know, what are the local political dynamics, not just the national dynamics being echoed locally. And look, I've done this, I've put in my 10,000 hours. So I know which reporters I trust and which ones I don't. I know which reporters at the Times that don't infuse politics and which do. Which reporters at the Journal to read, which opinion writers to read.
So if you're just getting started on that.
The way I look at it is I would do this. I would consume the Post, the Times, and the Journal, those 3, all of it. Because whatever you think of those news organizations, they drive Washington and New York, period. So in that sense, you've got to know everything that's happening. I look at it this way. I think the best international reporting is still out of the Times. I think the best reporting about the Republican Party is taking place in the Journal. And I think the Post has got most of its Washington mojo back. I certainly trust the Post over the Times on politics these days. I feel like there's a little more, it's not that it's partisan at the Times, it feels out of touch. It does feel like a New York City publication that doesn't quite know where I feel like the Post, I always say Washington is strange. We're the biggest city that's still bipartisan.
Yeah.
It's not, we actually, Republicans and Democrats hang out with each, or they don't hang out anymore, but they have to interact a lot. You go to Chicago, and Republicans don't interact with Democrats. New York, you go to so many places you don't see that. Washington is one of the unique places, and the Post is more reflective of that than I think people give it credit for. So and then, look, then you start, I personally would always want to have consumed something locally. And I certainly am a believer that if you live in the state of Illinois, you should know what's going on in Springfield. So, and I'd be consuming that. So if I were here, I would, and when I was in college, it was, we went to, both of us went to GW. You could get the Journal, the Times, and the Post delivered to your dorm room, which for a weirdo
Hard
like
copy.
me in 1990 was kind of cool. I thought that was great, and it was cheap.
It was free.
Yeah.
It was free when I went there.
Wow. I don't remember it being fully
Or
subsidized.
probably paid for it.
Felt like I had to pay something. But I think they made me take an Amex card for it or something. I remember they were shoving credit cards down your throat back then. But I think you have to decide over time who's credible. And, ask yourself when somebody's being opinionated and when somebody is reporting. I think it's pretty clear. You have to trust yourself. You can't. I do think we're going to be a world of what I call trusted curators, right? I think that while we're disrupting the major networks who were sort of the curators of the 20th century, I do think now we'll have instead of 5 major curating networks, there'll be 20. Major curating networks of sorts.
And are they on Substack or are they on podcast?
Some will be on Substack, some we haven't seen yet. Hopefully I'm involved in one that scales up local news, right? In my world, but I think that's where we're headed into sort of a new, and we go through this, each new technological advancement has both created a new media company and made one obsolete. So for instance, when we figured out how to reproduce photographs easily, then Life magazine and something called Look magazine became relevant. And then when we figured out satellite live shots, CNN could not have started as a network in 1969. But by 1979, there were enough satellites where you could do live shot, where what they were doing, going live around the world, was even possible. We have not had a news organization develop based on the new abilities that we have today, which is we can be anywhere. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that NBC used to make a big deal about where Matt Lauer was.
Yeah.
Now, of course, nobody knows where Matt Lauer is. But it was this huge deal. Where in the world is Matt Lauer?
Yeah.
We're going live from Africa in the sand dunes, or we're like, we're in Kuala Lumpur. How did we do it? Well, shoot, we can do that anytime we want now. Yeah. Anybody can. We haven't had a news organization created with what I would say is multiple streams coming at you, however you want it, So I think that this is where, I actually think could be an exciting moment in the world of media because we are in a disruptive moment. I think we are in old-fashioned creative destruction. And yes, mainstream media as we know it is dead. Long live mainstream media. There'll be a new mainstream to replace it. And I just think we're in the middle of this right now.
Got it. Here's another audience question. How difficult was it to get where you are in your career, and how long did it take you?
That's an interesting way of putting it.
It sounds like it might be a student wondering.
Well, I will say
thinking
this.
Ahead.
I went to, so I'll just give you my quick little sort of how I got here.
Why you read 50 papers today?
Why I have to read 50 papers a day. So I just sort of, it was 8th grade that I caught the political bug. I had a cousin staying with us. He was working on a campaign. He was a big liberal. My dad was a big conservative. And he stayed with us all summer. My cousin was, I was an only child, so he was the closest thing I had to a brother. So he was always sort of a big brother. I kind of looked up to him. So I was fascinated with what he was doing. And I was 14, I guess, at the time. And the two of them would argue every night, getting pretty drunk. I was the bartender. It was the 80s. Don't judge. And I also knew when to make the espresso, and to sober them up so they could all go to bed. But I just found, I ended up just, they would go back and forth. I thought it was really cool. They named all 100 senators one night after drinking. And I'm like, wow. Like, I thought you could kind of tell what kind of weirdo I was, right? I ended up in the right business. So anyway, I thought I wanted to work in politics. I didn't know I wanted to do journalism. Took me a while to accept journalism, and I don't mean it negatively. I just thought I would always, I applied to all schools in Washington, D.C. I wanted to be in Washington. I thought I wanted to work in politics. And then I worked on a presidential campaign briefly. I did FEC compliance, 1991 for a guy named Tom Harkin. The campaign, I say 91 because it didn't really make it to 92, even though it was the 92 presidential year. And so then I needed work. And I got an internship at something called The Hotline. And it was a brand new, and it was on this thing called a modem. And you uploaded things. I don't even want to get into how, but we were basically the internet before there was the internet, is what The Hotline was. And it was basically a trade publication covering the business of politics, the campaign side of politics. And man, it's like giving it's like if you were a sports addict, getting to be able to work at the Sporting News at that time or getting to work at ESPN at that time, that's where I felt like I was working. And suddenly I was like, oh, I want to cover all sides.
Yeah.
This is fun. And that's what I did, so, and I caught a break because the internet explodes in 90, I'm working there in 92. The internet explodes in 94. In 96, you had these major media companies, the Washington Post, ABC, Newsweek, all wanted to dabble in the internet, but none of them wanted to do it on their own. So they partnered with our little company.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were basically their worker bees to experiment on what's this internet thing. And so in 1996, we did a collective called Politics Now. And the idea was we were going to have the best political reporting from the Washington Post, the LA Times, ABC News, and Newsweek. But guess what? None of those reporters at ABC News, the Washington Post, LA Times, or Newsweek wanted to write for this thing called the internet. They all either wanted to be on TV or on the front page of their papers. So 24-year-old me became the polling expert for our little website. And, for all the libertarians that visited our website in 96, I thank you. Because, by the way, the only people on the internet back in the mid-90s were the libertarians. How did I find this out? We tried to host these little chats. And, at the time, and that was a big deal, right? These internet chats. And
just text only.
Right, text only, but you would chime in. Well, the biggest audience we ever got is when we hosted Harry Brown, the libertarian nominee for president. And that's when I found out every IT guy in America is a libertarian. And I say that with respect. I think, by the way, have you noticed we're all become a little libertarian when the other party's in office, whatever your other party is, right? And it's amazing how the poor libertarians, we're all kind of we're all more libertarian than we think. And we don't realize it until our, quote, side's not in power. And then we're either libertarians about our bodies or we're libertarians about our culture, or sometimes both, right? But I look at it and I caught a break because older people were snobs about technology. Sorry. And that's the big lesson I've taken from my career, which is don't be a snob about technology. As I also at the same time refuse to go on TikTok. So I'm still learning myself about whether I should listen to that advice.
Well, Kara Swisher uses a burner phone for TikTok. So
I just don't accept the premise that I have to buy a separate phone to do TikTok.
I know.
But as a journalist, I feel like
as a
journalist, I feel like I'm stuck because I got to know what's happening on TikTok without just finding out what my daughter's seeing on TikTok, which usually is something Taylor Swiftish. So anyway.
So talk to us about NBC. You came in, Tim Russert brought you in. You were political director. You were chief White House correspondent. You held multiple anchor roles on MSNBC. Tell us a little bit about that.
As in, well, I feel like I got to do a little bit.
You evolved from print to TV.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, I was one of those who thought TV was would always dumb down politics.
And here you are.
And here I am trying to defend TV, even though they dumbed down politics. But I got to come over to NBC when they were in an expansion mode, when NBC wanted to get bigger. When in the news presence, not smaller. And it's a lot more fun to be at a big company with resources when they want to expand. It is no fun to be at a big company when you're no longer the pretty person at the dance. And that's the situation we're in now, right? We were We were the cool kids for a while until we weren't. But look, up until about 6 months ago, I would have argued that it's been great to be owned by a big company like Comcast. And when they bought us, you were there when they bought us.
Yep.
When we moved from, I mean, being owned by GE was weird. Okay. We used to have to do these training, everybody had to do the same employee training videos. And we do these training videos about like how to deal with chemical spills.
And widgets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're just sitting there going, we're not, and then, when you're lifting up a propeller, be sure to use this back brace. And you're like, what do we know about propellers? At least Comcast was in the same general business that we're in when they bought us. But it's having the resources of a Comcast made me feel safe traveling around the world. When Richard Engel was kidnapped,
Foreign correspondent
in Syria, let me put it this way. If we had a journalist in Russia, the way the Wall Street Journal did, we'd have gotten our journalists out of there a lot sooner than the Journal was able to. I mean, it's just Comcast has that many more resources, that much more influence and all this stuff. But the fact when they can turn the spigot off, this is a choice. Comcast is doing really well. They don't have to cut. I go through this with the news division. I would be told, well, we got to cut back on this and all this. And I'm like, why? Well, we just don't have it in the budget. Okay. Well, we do. We're just making a choice. This is a choice. It is not driven. It is certainly driven in the moment by some revenue challenges about what to advertise on. But there are plenty of ways to make money if they want to allow it to stand alone. I think right now they just don't want to be in the news business. And Disney doesn't want to be in the news business. And Warner Brothers doesn't want to be.
And why is that?
Well, I think they don't want the attention from Donald Trump. It has been bad for business. And if you're Disney, you'd rather have everybody watching Moana 2, not just the left or not just the right, right? And if you're Comcast, you want everybody showing up to Universal Parks, not just the left and not just the right. It is the cliche of, and this is what everybody wants to do business. And that's why I do think media, the long-term survival of independent journalism, look, I think we've got to create models like the Green Bay Packers. They're community owned. I think the Washington Post should be community owned. Shareholders, the public, a public trust that's for profit, not nonprofit. I think nonprofit does two things. Leans left subtly to people, which I think is you don't want to automatically have people assume that. And the other thing that nonprofit is, it lacks urgency. Now, I think there are ways that nonprofits can help newsrooms cover more subject. Like the best use of nonprofit money I've seen is to provide reporters who are experts in housing, right? That's not something that's naturally comes to a lot of newsrooms. But if you have an entity that is willing to fund that specific reporter. So these are the ways that I think is the best. If I were advice, I understand there's a lot of philanthropy money out there that wants to help in the news space. That to me is the better place to help. Is in reporter training and things like this, providing resources for these smaller local news operations to be able to do more with fewer resources.
Okay. We're almost out of time here. We had one audience question about your most memorable interview, your most favorite interview. Maybe we can end on some fun story you have of someone you're going to come up with here.
Well, no, there's sort of when I get asked this question, and it's like in some ways you have to. Look, I feel like alternative facts is going to be my obituary.
Totally.
So, and you've already, I'll be honest, I hated it. I hated the moment. I hated everything about it.
What was that like in real time? Because
I remember like coming out going, oh man.
When she said that, you could see it on your face, and you're just like.
The thing that I hated the most about that clip is that I start laughing. Because I'm laughing at the absurdity.
Yeah.
But I felt like that was the wrong emotion. Look, I did Pride myself on the fact Meet the Press had a very tripartisan audience, not just bipartisan. So and I didn't, I know some people took the laughing different way. And so there are just moments where you just remind yourself that you just, so that's what the interview I'm proudest of is one I did with Dick Cheney on the torture report. And why? Well, the reason I'm proud of it for a number of reasons, but I'm also proud of it because of the way it's one of those things where I think now the rest of America gets the Cheneys, but at the time people didn't understand the Cheneys. Okay, these are patriots. You may disagree with them, but they're patriots. And Dick Cheney thought it was important in retirement to come out and explain himself about the torture report. And we had his longtime spokesperson was a reporter for us at NBC News named Pete Williams. So, and I had a relationship, I'd had a very, good working relationship with the former vice president in a number of capacities, certainly with his staff. So, and he was partial to Meet the Press. Okay?
He'd been on it for decades.
That's right.
Yeah.
He was partial to it. And he had enough of it. So he didn't feel like he was going to get sandbagged, but at the same time, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. And I was never more nervous for an interview because I did feel like I was interviewing Darth Vader, and I say this with love, because he can be menacing. He's not, but he has the look, right? He's actually a sweetheart of a man, but he has that, very serious look about it. And I went into every detail that was done. And, we went through just sort of make him defend it, which he felt he needed to do. And it was sort of like, to me, it's the model interview of what you want, which is the public servant willing to put himself out there to be held accountable. Tough, what I'd like to think was tough, but fair. And I thought that the viewer was educated and uncomfortable. I used to say this about Meet the Press: if you're not uncomfortable for 5 minutes, I haven't done my job. You should always be uncomfortable for at least 5 minutes on Meet the Press. Your point of view should be challenged, or whatever it is. You should feel a little bit uncomfortable in order to, that means I'm making you think. Or the program, or somebody on the show is making you think. So that was one I was really proud of. And then there's one other cooler thing. The first time I interviewed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I just thought it was, and he came and on set. And
he was in the lunchroom.
Oh, I know. I remember he was just hanging out.
Commissary, and I was in line behind him, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!"
Oh, it was fascinating. He has lived a life that still is not properly put into context. I did a bunch of deep dive on him, and he had a huge connection to Washington, D.C. when he was on the wrong side of Islam for a period of time, which he himself admits that he ended up in the sort of the Elijah Muhammad side, not actual Islam. And when he first broke off, he bought a house for others who sort of were escaping the Farrakhan folks, and provided the safe haven in Washington, D.C., and the house got firebombed. This was in 1972. And I remember researching this story. I'm like, why isn't this more famous? Why isn't this more known? This was a house owned by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at the time. He was still a Milwaukee Buck, for what it's worth, if you're those following his career. Anyway, having moments like that with folks like that was sort of the fun perks, doing an interview in Yankee Stadium. I'm not a Yankees fan, but you got to do Meet the Press in Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
And I got the NFL mad at me once, which was also a badge of honor. They wouldn't let me broadcast from the Super Bowl one year because I was doing a segment on concussions. They said if I got rid of the concussion segment, I could do my show from the Super Bowl. I did my show from the Washington, D.C. Studio, and we did our concussion story. So,
wow.
Yeah. So that's one of those that the NFL is very powerful. Oh, NBC Sports was not going to have my back on that.
Yeah.
Like, nope, Super Bowl matters more. Got it. Good to know. They're like, you can report. We're not going to ask you not to do it. We're just not going to let you use the Super Bowl set. You're like, okay.
Oh, man. Okay, final parting advice for student journalists or students of media.
This is the best time to get into it. You know, don't. I entered media at a time that it was in the middle of something. It was, you had media outlets going out of business. You had all these little startups happening. Most of them failed. But there was a lot of experimental journalism out there and experimental business models with journalism. And this was in the 90s when the internet was just getting started. So I kind of think that there's a lot of entrepreneurial opportunity. There's a lot of legacy media that's desperate to understand how people under 30 consume information. So you come in, you have an advantage. If you want to go work for a big company, there's an open door right now because there's a desperate need for knowledge on that front. But I just think that don't let the negative headlines about legacy media shrinking discourage you from the world of journalism. I think the demand has never been greater. The barrier to entry has never been lower. Whether it's starting your own Substack or starting your own feed. So I just think don't assume you should follow. I don't think my path's going to exist in 5 years, but that shouldn't be discouraging. That should be encouraging. Because the path I took didn't exist 10 years before I got to take it. I went in a different path that didn't exist even 10 years before. So in some ways, why should, you're blazing a new trail and that's okay. Not only that, it's probably more opportunistic, to be perfectly selfish about it. So jump into the journalism pool. The water's nice.
Chuck Todd, thank you.
You got it. Thanks, Colleen.